Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1. The Ship Without a Captain. A little boy first sighted the masts of the ship Pharaon. She was coming home to Marseille, France, with a cargo of cloth and dyes. As usual, a crowd gathered to watch the docking, an exciting event in 1815, for the handling of big sailing ships was an art. But the Pharaon proceeded toward port so slowly that the onlookers felt something must be wrong on board. Monsieur Morel, the owner, was overjoyed to hear that his ship was home. Now he saw that a tall sailor stood beside the wheel, where old Captain Leclerc should have been. Morel ordered a rowboat. He wanted to know the bad news at once. As he neared the Pharaon, he saw she was under the command of Edmond Dantes. Edmond ordered a rope dropped, and his employer climbed aboard. He looked anxiously into Edmond's dark, intelligent eyes that now were full of sympathy. "Bad news, sir. Captain Leclerc is dead, and buried at sea. He came down with brain fever after we left Naples, Italy. He was raving toward the end, so I gave the crew orders from then on. Your cargo and ship are safe and sound." Morel heard this news with many changes of expression. Though his captain was dead, before him stood a fine replacement. Edmond Dantes was tall and strong, and knew the sea. His handsome face was sunburned from many voyages, though he was only 19. Morel shook Edmond's hand and thanked him. "I must consult my partner, but I think he will agree with me that the new captain of the Pharaon will be you." Edmond's face lit up with happiness. "I hoped, sir, that I might have a chance. The crew and I are like brothers. Not one resents my youth and—" Edmond stopped, and his face clouded. He was watching a man who had come from below, and was now walking toward them. The newcomer was a grim-faced man about 26. This was Monsieur Danglars. Edmond corrected his last statement. "There may be one who is not like my brother." "Please excuse me, sir. I must give orders to drop anchor and dock the ship." Danglars greeted his employer with a great show of respect. He glanced around to see that no one else was listening before he said, "Monsieur Morel, I must report the mishandling of the Pharaon. No sooner was our wonderful captain dead when this Dantes seized command. Then he lost us time by putting into the island of Elba for no reason. The ship needed no repairs. Perhaps he merely wished to have a stroll ashore after being so long at sea. He is very young, you know." Morel frowned. That was very wrong. But as for taking command, he had that right as first mate, Danglars. It was good experience since he will be the new captain if my partner agrees with me. Danglars' grim face concealed his disappointment at these words. He wanted to be made captain himself, mainly because of the increase in salary that went with it. When Morel questioned Edmond about the stop at Elba, he found the young man's answer satisfactory. Just before Captain Leclerc began raving from his fever, he had ordered the stop. Edmond was to report to Napoleon in Leclerc's place, and obey any orders the ex-emperor of France gave. When Morel heard Napoleon mentioned, he looked around uneasily. Napoleon had been stripped of his powers, and now lived in exile on Elba. But there were many Frenchmen who worked in secret to restore him to the throne. Morel was a businessman, and did not involve himself in politics, so he asked no further questions about the visit to Elba, and cautioned Edmond not to mention it to anyone else. "Captain Leclerc said the same thing to me," said Edmond, "and if you had not asked me, I would not have told you about Elba. Now, sir, may I request leave of absence? Danglars will see to the listing of cargo." Morel smiled. "You wish time off to get married, I believe. I have heard that a lovely young woman named Mercedes waits for you impatiently. Permission granted." Edmond's delight at this praise of Mercedes' beauty and faithfulness showed in his wide smile. "Yes, sir. We expect to be married at once, but first I must go to Paris to deliver something." An hour later, Edmund was running up the stairs to the tiny apartment he shared with his elderly father. Monsieur Dantes embraced his son and gave thanks for his safe return. Much as the father wanted to hear about the voyage and to enjoy his son's presence, he knew that another shared Edmund's love. "Go to Mercedes now, my boy," he said. "I will prepare a special dinner for us." As Edmund hurried to her house, Mercedes was having an unpleasant talk with her cousin, Fernand, a soldier. She had endured this same conversation many times since Edmund had sailed. It was Fernand's proposal of marriage. Each time he proposed, she would refuse him and remind him that she loved Edmund. Then Fernand would lose his temper, draw his sword, and wave it wildly, swearing to kill Edmund. Sighing at a familiar scene, Mercedes would threaten him again and again that if he hurt Edmund even slightly, her cousinly love for Fernand would change into hatred. Now Mercedes repeated what was always her final statement: "I will never marry anyone but Edmund Dantes." At this moment, Edmund entered and heard her declaration. Mercedes sprang up with a cry of happiness and rushed into Edmund's arms. They kissed and pledged their love anew. Mercedes' eyes shone when Edmund told her he was to be the next captain of the Pharaon. Forgotten in the background, Fernand watched the lovers with bitterness. He hated Edmund Dantes with all his heart, but he could do nothing about it. Chapter 2. Arrested. Finally, unable to bear the sight of the happy couple, Fernand rushed out of the house. Mercedes followed him. "Dear cousin, I want you to embrace my husband-to-be," she pleaded. "I know he will find a true friend in you, as I did." Fernand shrank back from this demand. As Edmund came to him with a smile and an outstretched hand, Fernand could only bring himself to touch the hand quickly and coldly. Then he hurried away, hardly watching where he was going. He was so deep in misery that he passed by an inn without noticing Danglars and another man seated at a table outside. Glasses of wine and a half-empty bottle were before them. Danglars called to Fernand and motioned the waiter to bring another glass. At the sound of his name, Fernand looked around wildly, as if awakened from a bad dream. "You called me?" he asked. The second man at the table was the Dantes' downstairs neighbor, a man named Caderousse. Now he answered Fernand. "Yes, we called. When we see a young lover running madly through the streets, we know fate has dealt him a blow, so we offer him some wine." With that, Caderousse filled the third glass, but spilled wine as he poured. He had already had 7 glasses. Fernand sat down with a groan. Ignoring the wine, he buried his head in his hands. "Why didn't the sea swallow him up?" he cried. "Other men leave and never return. Why must Dantes come back to claim Mercedes?" Caderousse turned to Danglars and winked. "See, Danglars, you have a brother in misery. You are united in your hatred of the handsome and lucky Edmund Dantes." Danglars had only drunk 1 glass of wine, so he was still thinking clearly. As he looked at Fernand's agony, his scheming mind began to form a plan for using the unhappy soldier for his own revenge. He said lightly, "In stories, one lover gets rid of a rival by a well-placed knife thrust. But perhaps real men are too timid for that." Fernand was stung by this insult and looked up angrily. "As a soldier and a man, I would not hesitate for one moment to put a knife in Dantes' heart," he cried. "But alas, Mercedes has forbidden it. I would earn his death and her hatred with the same blow." "Well then," said Caderousse cheerfully, "you will just have to see them married before the Pharaon sails again under its new commander, Captain Edmund Dantes." This time it was Danglars who looked up angrily. I will thank you, Caderousse, not to keep mentioning my loss. If certain authorities knew what I know, Dantes would not be made captain. In fact, he would be arrested for conspiring against our good king, Louis XVIII. Danglars saw he had the full attention of the other men, though Caderousse was beginning to succumb to too much wine. Danglars leaned across the table and whispered, Edmond Dantes stopped the ship at Elba and went ashore to see an enemy of the king, the exiled Napoleon. When he came back on board, he carried a letter. It was no doubt addressed to Napoleon's friends in Paris. Then after we docked, he asked Monsieur Morel for a leave of absence, not only to get married, but to take something to Paris. It must be that letter. Where is the letter now? Asked Fernand, shocked at such dangerous conduct. It must be in one of 3 places, replied Danglars. Dantes may be carrying it, or he has left it at his father's apartment, or it is in his cabin on board ship. Fernand now went very pale. In a voice shaking with determination, he cried, I shall go to the king's prosecutor, here in Marseille, and denounce Edmond Dantes as an enemy of the king. Danglars shook his head in disapproval. They will make you sign your declaration. Then they will put him in prison, but only for a few years. The day that he is freed, he will come looking for you. He will attack you, and you will have to defend yourself. As a soldier, you are experienced in fighting, and you may wound him fatally. Mercedes will hate you for that, but then she would already hate you for denouncing him in the first place. Fernand's shoulders drooped. You are right. I can do nothing to him. There is a way to do it, I think, said Danglars. He ordered a waiter to bring pen and ink and paper. Then he wrote a letter with his left hand, so his handwriting would not be recognized. He put in all the facts he had told Fernand and Caderousse. He signed the letter, A Friend, folded it in 2, and addressed it to the king's prosecutor. Fernand took the letter and read it aloud, with much satisfaction. Caderousse, though very drunk, made an effort to follow the reading. Oh, that is a terrible thing to say, complained Caderousse. Dantes is my neighbor, and I know this would break his father's heart. He reached out an unsteady hand to grab the letter, but Danglars quickly snatched it from Fernand and crumpled it into a loose ball. Then he said with a laugh, You are right, friend Caderousse. We were only making a joke. I never meant to send such a document, because Dantes is my shipmate. He tossed the crumpled letter into the bushes near the table, then added, Now I will help you home, for too much wine will cause a man to stagger. Goodbye, Fernand. Danglars helped Caderousse to his feet, and led him away from the inn. The drunken man went willingly, but slowly. As they walked up the street, Danglars glanced back. Fernand had risen and was searching in the bushes for the letter. Danglars smiled to himself, well pleased with his own cleverness and judgment of other men. Near noon the next day, a procession of people in their best clothes walked to that same inn. In the lead was Edmond, his handsome face aglow with happiness. Mercedes walked at his right, linking her arm with his. She wore a long, flowing white gown. Its style was simple but elegant, making her look more like a Greek goddess than a 17-year-old girl of Marseille. On her head was a circlet of fresh flowers. Her eyes were shining. Edmond had a single flower pinned to the jacket of his sailor's dress outfit. A similar flower adorned the lapel of old Monsieur Dantes' best black coat. He had brushed the coat well and polished its steel buttons. A 3-cornered hat sat on his white hair at a jaunty angle. He walked in the crowd just behind Mercedes. After them walked Monsieur Morel, the shipowner, whose presence was a great honor. With him was Fernand, who was so pale that some wondered if he were ill. Then came Caderousse, Danglars, and all the sailors on the Pharaon. They were accompanied by their wives and sweethearts. This, then, was the procession heading to the engagement luncheon of Edmund and Mercedes. The inn was closed to outsiders that day, and all the tables had been arranged to form one long one. Mercedes sat midway, with Monsieur Dantes and Fernand on either side of her. Edmund sat across from them, between Monsieur Morel and Danglars. The rest of the group seated themselves as they chose, with much noise and good-natured shoving. Toasts to the engaged couple were offered first by Morel, and then by Monsieur Dantes. Soon the innkeeper and his helpers began a parade of special dishes to the celebrators. These dishes included lobster and sausages cooked in 5 different ways. The platters were decorated with clusters of tomatoes, parsley, and onions. Edmund and Mercedes were too busy gazing at each other across the table to bother eating. Edmund could not stop smiling, for he considered himself the happiest man in the world. Caderousse led all the guests in eating heartily, all, that is, except Fernand. He only picked at his food while nervously watching the door that opened to the outside. After a while, Edmund stood up and took out his pocket watch. "My friends," he announced, "I have a surprise. With Monsieur Morel's help, Mercedes and I have been able to rush through the many papers required before a marriage may take place. Therefore, this is not an engagement feast you are eating, but a wedding feast." He looked at his watch. "We will be married in exactly 1/2 hour from now. The mayor awaits us." This announcement caused a sensation, and several cheers went up. There was one last toast, then everyone assembled at the door, ready to make the walk to the town hall into a happy parade. One of Edmund's shipmates threw open the door, only to find 2 soldiers standing there. They pushed the sailor back into the room, and motioned the others to move away. A magistrate entered, wearing his official black robe. "Where is Edmund Dantes?" he asked. Edmund dropped Mercedes' hand and stepped forward. "Here, sir." In a cold, official voice, the magistrate said, "I arrest you in the name of the law. Follow me." He turned and started out. Immediately, the 2 soldiers placed themselves, one in front and one in back of Edmund, and waited for him to obey. Edmund was too shocked to move. "Arrested? Me? Why, sir?" he cried. "I have done nothing. This must be a mistake." The magistrate turned back for a moment. "I have been ordered to arrest Edmund Dantes, and I am arresting Edmund Dantes. The reasons will be told to you by the king's prosecutor. Now come along." Monsieur Morel, though greatly disturbed, knew that this was the way the law did things. He whispered, "Go, Edmund. This man is only doing as he has been told. When you see the prosecutor, it will all be cleared up." These words calmed Edmund, and he said almost cheerfully to the magistrate, "Sir, I am at your service. I wish that we might go quickly, so that I may return the sooner. I have important business to attend to in a half hour." At this, there were laughter and cheers. Several sailors shook Edmund's hand, and the women waved their handkerchiefs, but Mercedes had turned pale. Edmund gave her a quick smile, and with head held high, he marched out between the soldiers. Chapter 3. The Assistant Prosecutor. As Edmund departed, old Monsieur Dantes collapsed in a half-faint. He had been in poor health, and the excitement of having Edmund home and about to be married had overtired him. Now the horror of seeing his beloved son marched away between soldiers proved too much. A chair was brought, and the old man was helped into it. Mercedes rubbed his hands to warm them. "Dear father, calm yourself," she said. "Edmund will return in a short while." You saw how he smiled. It is some silly mistake. Perhaps the person responsible for it is apologizing at this moment. Monsieur Dantes looked into her eyes. He saw the same fear in them that he knew showed in his own. "No, Mercedes," he whispered. "I feel something terrible is going to happen to Edmund." Hearing the old man speak her own fears, Mercedes turned from him and buried her face in her hands. A sob escaped her. Seeing the terrified old man and young girl, Caderousse frowned. He tried to remember exactly what had happened at the table outside the inn the day before. It was hard because he had been in a drunken haze. But enough realization of what was going on had come through. He whispered to Danglars, "This is some part of the trick you were going to play, you and Fernand. It is shameful." Danglars looked at him coldly. "I know nothing about this arrest. Your drinking has confused you. Be quiet." Since Monsieur Morel was an important person, he knew that he might be able to find out the reason for Edmund's arrest. So he had followed the soldiers and their prisoner. Now, as he returned to the inn, a worried expression clouded his face. He went straight to Monsieur Dantès and Mercedes. "My friends," he said solemnly, "a very serious charge has been made against Edmund. Someone has accused him of being a secret agent for Napoleon, and thus a traitor to the king." Meanwhile, in the office of the assistant prosecutor, these same accusing words were being said to Edmond Dantès. The prosecutor himself was ill in bed, and had sent his capable assistant, Monsieur Villefort, to deal with the matter. The two men were alone in the room, though soldiers stood on guard outside the door. Edmund stared in amazement at the assistant prosecutor. "No, sir, I am not a secret agent. I have no political opinions. I am only a sailor, and my concerns are my ship, my father, and my intended wife." Villefort, older than Edmund by only 10 years, was impressed by the sincere way in which Edmund uttered his statement. Villefort also saw intelligence in Edmund's face, though he realized the young man's education was confined to matters of the sea and sailing. Finally, it was of interest to him that he and Edmund shared a coincidence. Both had been celebrating their wedding feasts, and had been interrupted in the middle of the festivities. Villefort's mind wandered for a moment to the lovely, rich young noblewoman he was to marry. Then Villefort brought his thoughts back to his duty. "Tell me, Monsieur Dantès, why did you stop the Pharaon at Elba and pick up a letter there?" Edmund told his story so convincingly that Villefort believed him. He asked to see the letter, but Edmund hesitated. "I have sworn, sir, to give this letter only to the person to whom it is addressed," he explained. "It is a man in Paris." Edmund's loyalty increased Villefort's admiration for him. It was obvious that the young sailor was a person of honor, and that his claim to innocence was completely true. Villefort smiled reassuringly. "I represent the law here, and the law commands you to hand over the letter. In doing so, you will not break your word, because my soldiers could take it from you by force. Give me the letter, with your conscience clear." At these words Edmund smiled too. "I give you the letter gladly, sir. Though you are the law, you respect a man's honor." From the inside pocket of his jacket, Edmund brought out a sealed white envelope and handed it to Villefort. The assistant prosecutor turned away from Edmund toward the lamp on his desk, so he would have more light by which to read the name on the envelope. Thus Edmund did not see the look of horror which came over Villefort's face when he read the name. Fearing for a moment that he might faint, Villefort steadied himself against his desk. He dared to read the name again, and the familiar address in Paris. It still read, "To Monsieur Noirtier." The letter was addressed to Villefort's father. Villefort had often told himself that one day this moment would happen, the moment when all he had worked for would vanish and he would be disgraced. But lately, as he became rich and attained the position of assistant prosecutor, he thought less and less about that moment. The final step into a secure life was his engagement to Renée. He had used his mother's name Villefort on coming to Marseille, so no one connected him with the notorious traitor, Noirtier, who was loyal to Napoleon, Politically, Noirtier had been quiet for years, but as Villefort now read in the letter, his father was to come out of hiding and lead a plot to restore Napoleon to the throne. As a loyal subject of the king, Villefort could not allow the letter to be delivered, but neither could he bring himself to have his own father arrested. This was not because he loved him, but because he feared that the connection between them would inevitably be revealed. Villefort made his decision quickly, then turned back to Edmund. "Who has seen this letter beside yourself?" he asked in a calm voice. Edmund answered with surprise. "I told you, sir. No one has seen it. I myself have not read the letter since it was sealed, but no one has even seen the envelope since I received it." Inwardly, Villefort gave thanks. He also gave thanks for the illness of his superior, an illness which had prevented the prosecutor from coming to the office today. If he had read the letter, Villefort would have been a ruined man. But now Villefort began to hope. He smiled at Edmund again and lowered his voice. "I believe you, Dantes, but having this letter as evidence is awkward. It is the only thing that supports the accusation made against you in this note we received." He handed Edmund the note written by Danglars with his left hand. Though the note was crumpled, Fernand had smoothed it out before he sent it. The signature still read, "A friend," with no further identification. Edmund read it and shook his head in bewilderment. "I don't know who could have written this," he said. Villefort returned the accusation to a folder marked Edmund Dantes. Then he took up the letter addressed to his father and turned it over in his hands, as if trying to decide a deep problem. Suddenly he winked at Edmund and strode to the fireplace. He tossed the letter into the flames. "I believed you are innocent, Dantes. Therefore I destroy the only evidence that exists against you." As Villefort saw the name Noirtier disappear into ashes, his heart beat normally again. "Thank you, sir," said Edmund. "You are more like my true friend than the king's prosecutor." "But now," said Villefort, returning to his desk, "you must take my advice. You must swear never to mention this letter or the name to whom it was addressed. Only you and I know it once existed." "I swear to tell no one," agreed Edmund eagerly. "If anyone questions me, I will deny such a letter ever existed. Now I must detain you a short while longer, until I have written a report," said Villefort, as an afterthought. He rang for the captain of the guards, then said something to him in a low tone of voice, so Edmund could not hear. To Edmund he said, "Go with him, Dantes." Edmund saluted Villefort and followed the captain of the guards with a light heart. He counted himself a lucky man to have had his case heard by the assistant prosecutor rather than the prosecutor. Villefort had said he must only stay a short while longer. Perhaps in an hour or less he would be back at Mercedes' side. Chapter 4. The Chateau d'If. The captain led Edmund across a courtyard and into an unheated building. Its windows were small and barred. As the captain passed, soldiers stood at attention. After walking down 2 flights of stairs, Edmund was motioned into a bare room with a table and a cot as its only furnishings. After the captain shut the door, Edmund heard a bolt being drawn. He was a prisoner in a cell. But Edmund was not worried by his situation, for the assistant prosecutor himself had declared him innocent. Edmund sat down on the cot to wait. As the hours passed, Edmund consulted his watch more and more anxiously. He was especially concerned that his father and Mercedes would be worrying about him. He kept reminding himself of the kindness and understanding that Villefort had shown. Finally, 6 hours later, the bolt was drawn. 4 armed soldiers summoned him out. Edmund stepped eagerly into the corridor, but was not led back to Villefort's office, as he expected. Instead, he was led upstairs and into the dark street where a carriage waited. Certain that there must be another mistake, Edmund hesitated to climb in. But the soldiers gave him a shove, and he climbed in quickly. 2 soldiers placed themselves on either side of him, and the carriage set off. Soon Edmund began to smell the sea, and he knew they were nearing the docks. In another moment the carriage stopped. Edmund was hustled out, and pushed toward a waiting rowboat, manned by 4 men. A soldier waiting on the dock appeared to be in charge. He listened to the instructions whispered by the 2 soldiers and nodded. "Where are you taking me?" asked Edmund, now very alarmed. He was sure he had been mistaken for another prisoner. "I am Edmund Dantes." "We know," said the man in charge of the boat. "Get in." He put a hand on Edmund's shoulder and forced him to jump down into the boat. He followed Edmund in, then gave the command to shove off. The only point of light Edmund could see on the water was the lighthouse, but the rowers did not strain their eyes to see in the dark. They pulled steadily and confidently as if the course they rowed was a familiar one. After his long confinement in the small cell, Edmund was grateful to smell the fresh sea air. But why should he be in a rowboat, in the middle of the night, going he did not know where? "Where are you taking me?" he demanded angrily. "Does Monsieur Villefort know what you are doing?" These questions annoyed the man in charge, for he frowned. "Don't pretend," he answered. "You come from Marseille, don't you? Everybody knows that pile of rocks." He gestured toward a dark fortress that they were approaching. It was the only structure on the small, rocky island just outside the harbor. Edmund looked where he pointed, then turned back with a gasp. "Not the Chateau d'If! Why, that is a prison!" At this last statement the man laughed. "And you, my friend, are a prisoner." "But I am innocent of any crime," protested Edmund wildly. "I have not even had a trial. Monsieur Villefort released me." The boat scraped against stone steps. One sailor jumped out and tied the boat to a ring cemented to a massive stone wall. With a nod, the man in charge indicated that Edmund was to proceed up the steps. He did so in a daze. At the top of the steps, the man in charge kicked at a heavy door. After a wait of some minutes, the door swung open to receive their party. Another door, guarded by 2 soldiers, barred their way. After a whispered consultation with the boatman, one soldier took Edmund by the elbow and led him through the second doorway. Thus, on the 28th of February, 1815, Edmund Dantes entered the Chateau d'If. Chapter 5. Number 34. Edmund was hurried down steep stone steps into a cell. Dampness and evil odors surrounded him. By the light of the jailer's lantern, he saw that the cell contained a chair, a table, a pail, and a cot with straw and a blanket thrown on top. While one jailer brought in some bread and a jug of water, another stood guard. But it was not necessary, for Edmund was so bewildered by what was happening to him that he was too weak to move, and too dazed to even breathe. When the jailers left, and he heard the iron door clang shut, he sank to the floor, where he had been standing. The next morning, Edmund's jailer found him still hunched over on the stone floor. He had not eaten, or drunk, or slept. When the jailer poked him, the spell of confusion broke at last, and Edmund wept wildly. When the jailer had gone, Edmund screamed at his closed door, demanding to know what crime he had committed. After a time, he sank into a despairing heap and stared at the floor again. When his jailer returned and saw that he had not eaten, he spoke encouragingly to him. The jailer was paid according to the number of prisoners he had to care for. If Edmund should die of starvation, the jailer's salary would be reduced. "You must keep up your strength," he told Edmund. "Perhaps in a year or 2, they will let you appeal your sentence. Others have been permitted to do so." "A year or 2?" Edmund was shocked. "I must speak to Monsieur Villefort now. Listen, please. I will pay you to take a message to him, and another one to a young girl called Mercedes in Marseille." The jailer laughed loudly. "I would be fired if I were caught carrying messages for prisoners," he explained. "You could not pay me enough to make me endanger my job. There is one prisoner here, a mad priest, who frequently offers me 1,000,000 francs to help him." Now Edmund stood up. Showing himself to be a strong young man, he said in a quiet but positive manner, "If you do not help me, one time when you enter this cell, I will be behind the door. I will seize you and choke the life out of you." At this, the jailer ran from the cell. He returned a few minutes later with 6 soldiers, all armed with guns. The soldiers forced Edmund from the cell and thrust him into a dungeon at the end of a dark corridor. There, Edmund closed his eyes and wondered if he were going mad. The days and nights passed slowly for Edmund. His jailers hardly spoke to him, and they never used his name. He was known simply as Number 34, for that was the number of his dungeon. Starved for conversation, Edmund begged his jailer for a few words, but the man merely shook his head no, put down the day's meal, and did not even glance at Edmund. Edmund talked out loud to himself constantly. Once, he had pitied galley slaves, but now he saw that they had some happiness. At least they breathed the sea air, and they had one another for companionship. Edmund had nothing. A year passed this way, and Edmund stopped trying to keep track of the date. He begged his jailers to let him go for a walk, to give him books, anything to pass the time. But his pleas were refused. Then he began to think about religion and pleaded with his jailer to permit him to see the prisoner they called the mad priest. "He is still a man of the church," thought Edmund, "and he will guide me in my prayers for release." But this visit was never permitted. Another year passed, and Edmund grew furious with his lot in life. He stopped praying and began to curse everyone who might have acted to imprison him. But he was so uneducated and so inexperienced in worldly matters that he could not imagine who would have wanted to harm him. Being young, he did not have many memories, so his boredom with his own thoughts became more intense. As the years passed, 4, 6, 8, 10, Edmund feared he was going mad. Sometime in his 12th year, Edmund came to a decision. "I wish to die," he said aloud. "I swear that I shall never eat or drink again." When his dinner was brought that evening, Edmund threw it out the small, barred window into the sea. He was intent on keeping his jailer from knowing what was happening, for he feared the prison authorities might order him fed by force. For a whole week, he threw out his food and drink, but the lack of water quickly sickened him. As Edmund grew weaker and weaker, it was all he could do to totter to the window and empty out his dish and mug. His jailer saw his weakness and thought he must be wasting away from some terrible illness. Finally, one evening, Edmund felt sure his end was near. He was almost happy as he drifted into a kind of twilight of half sleeping and half waking. Silently, he blessed his father and Mercedes. His breathing grew more and more shallow. In another hour, the suffering and the life of number 34 would be over. Chapter 6. Scrape, Scrape, Scrape. As Edmund lay dying on his cot, he heard a noise, a constant scraping. His dungeon was infested with rats and large bugs, but this scraping was different from any of their sounds. Edmund raised his head weakly and listened harder. The sound was like a large claw scraping on the stone wall near his cot. His heart gave a great lurch as he realized that some prisoner was attempting to escape. The thought of someone making his way to freedom made Edmund feel dizzy. He told himself that his weakness was making him hear things. But the sound continued. It cannot be a workman for the prison, Edmund reasoned, because it is the middle of the night. His starving body then caused him to fall into a disturbed sleep. He awoke in the morning angry with himself. Perhaps some fellow sufferer was trying to signal him, and he had not heard. When the jailer brought his breakfast, Edmund gobbled it up. His desire for death had vanished. Now his one thought was to make contact with whoever was scraping. After breakfast, Edmund waited tensely by the wall for an hour. Then it came. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He leaped up and grabbed his chair. Knocking the back of the chair against the wall, he made a clunking noise. He did it 3 times. At once the scraping stopped. Edmund knocked 3 times more. Trembling, he waited to hear something. Anything. For an hour he stood there, holding the chair, ready to respond. At last the sound behind the wall came again. In a fever of joy, Edmund beat the back of the chair against the wall. Then he stopped suddenly, fearful that a jailer might hear him. To calm his rapidly beating heart, he threw himself down on his cot. There he reproached himself for wasting 12 years by never trying to escape, as the man behind his wall was trying. This thought propelled Edmund off his cot and into a search for something to scrape with. His cot had iron clamps, but they were screwed tightly into the wood. His eyes lit up when he saw his water mug. Without hesitation, he dropped the mug onto the stone floor. It broke, and Edmund selected the largest and sharpest fragment. Then, he attacked the wall with it. The scraping on the other side was so much like a companionship that Edmund found himself crying with happiness. The plaster that held the stones of the wall together was crumbly from age and from the dampness of the dungeon. Edmund scraped vigorously and was soon rewarded by a shower of plaster dust and small pieces of stone. He worked through the day. Before his jailer arrived with dinner, he moved his bed to conceal the loosening stone. He trickled the plaster dust out the window, then hid his scraper under his blanket and lay down on top of it. Edmund was given another mug. The jailer did not notice that one large piece of the broken mug was missing when he swept the fragments from the dungeon. After dinner, Edmund waited an hour before daring to go back to his task. While he waited, he rested because he was still weak from starving himself. This pattern continued for the next 2 days. By then, Edmund had cleared all the plaster from the sides of one stone. But when he tried to move the huge slab, his fingers could not budge it. He needed a lever to work the stone out. Desperately, Edmund examined his dungeon. Nothing. "I cannot fail now," he told himself, pacing back and forth in his anxiety. The jailers had begun bringing around dinner. The clank of their utensils came to Edmund's ears along with an idea. His nightly soup was brought in an iron pot. Its iron handle would make a perfect lever, but the jailer usually poured his soup from this pot into his plate and took the pot away with him. Suppose, Edmund whispered to himself with a wild surge of hope, just suppose I did not have a plate. Quickly, he put his plate in front of the door, then flung himself on his cot to watch and hope. Edmund's jailer entered. All his attention was centered on not spilling the soup. So he did not see the plate before his heavy foot crunched down on it. "Look what you have made me do," complained the jailer. "You have left your plate in my way. First your mug, now your plate. Do you think our citizens have nothing to do with their tax money but buy you dishes?" He was angry with Edmund, but also with himself, for it was his foot that broke the dish. "All right, take the pot for your soup plate. See if you can keep that in one piece." Edmund almost fainted with joy. At most he had hoped to have the iron pot for one night. Now it was to be his permanently. That night, he levered the big stone out easily with the pot handle, and set to work scraping around the next stone. A passageway began to form, with the first stone being moved in and out to conceal the entrance. Edmund found that the stones beyond it could be pushed under a wooden beam that arched in back of the wall. The day came when Edmund and the first scraper were working on the same stone from opposite ends. Edmund scraped with almost insane energy until they moved the last stone aside. On their knees in the passageway, the two prisoners faced one another. They stretched out trembling hands and touched. Edmund drew the other man forward while he inched backward toward his entrance. Back in his dungeon, Edmund reached down and helped the other man to his feet. "Who are you?" Edmund asked. His voice shook so that he had to repeat the question. The man answered, "I am Father Fariah. The jailers call me the Mad Priest." Chapter 7. The Mad Priest. The Mad Priest was rather short. His hair was white from suffering, but his beard, which reached down to his chest, was still black. Yet he was probably 65 years old. His eyes burned, not with madness, as the jailers said, but with intelligence. At once Edmund poured out the story of his imprisonment. Then it was Father Fariah's turn. The priest had been at the Chateau d'If 16 years, 4 years longer than Edmund. He was Italian, a man of the church, and learned. Political enemies had caused his arrest, after the death of the rich Cardinal Spada, who had protected Fariah and treated him like a son. As he listened, Edmund felt that his whole world had turned over, now that he had a friend. He dared to say friend, even though Fariah was so much older and so much better educated than he. Edmund would never have dared consider such a man his friend back in Marseille. On his side, Fariah was warmed by Edmund's youth and admiration for him. For the next few weeks, the two men used the passageway freely to go between Edmund's dungeon and the priest's cell. This cell was a larger and fitter place to live than the dungeon, since Fariah was not considered dangerous, only mad, by his jailers. Edmund was in a constant state of amazement at the priest's accomplishments. Fariah had made a rope ladder, using the threads unraveled from his blanket. The sharp bone of a fish had been fashioned into a needle. Cartilage or tissue fibers from other fish were made into pens, and an unused fireplace provided soot for ink. With such writing tools, Fariah had covered all of his shirts and handkerchiefs with his political ideas on the government in Italy. Sometimes he even used his own blood to write with. Finally, he showed Edmund his main accomplishment, a razor-sharp knife made from a candlestick. As all these treasures were laid before Edmund, he began to weep at his own inferiority. Not only was he ignorant of everything written on Fariah's cloth, but also he had wasted his prison years in idleness. At Edmund's confession, Fariah's eyes shone, for he loved to teach. At once, he formed a plan for Edmund's education. He himself knew 4 languages, and had read widely in all of them. He was determined to pass them and all that he knew of mathematics, physics, and history on to Edmund. During the next year and a half, Fariah taught, and Edmund made rapid progress. He was delighted to find within himself a love of learning, and he worked hard at his studies. Another change occurred in him. Without realizing it, he began to adopt Fariah's refined, quiet way of speaking and moving. Soon the rough sailor vanished, and an educated young gentleman emerged. With his newly found powers of thinking, Edmund also plotted their escape. They would tunnel into the corridor in front of Fariah's cell. In the middle of the night, they would burst out of the tunnel and overpower the 2 guards who always sat half asleep at a table. Dressed in the guards' uniforms and using their keys, they would make their way out of the prison. Then they would jump into the sea and swim to safety. The 2 friends shook hands on it. Chapter 8. The Treasure on Monte Cristo. Weeks, then months went by. One day, as Edmund and Faria rested from the hard work of tunneling, Edmund said, "Father, I have been thinking about my enemies. Your lessons on history have taught me how the minds of some men work in evil ways. I believe I was accused by two men, Danglars and Fernand. Danglars saw me carry the letter away from Elba, and he had hoped to be captain of the Pharaon until I was chosen. Fernand hated me because Mercedes had consented to be my wife and not his. I could confirm these suspicions if I could talk to our old neighbor, Caderousse. I saw him after my return, sitting and drinking with Danglars and Fernand. They may have been talking about me, for as I passed the inn, they stopped talking and pretended not to notice me." "Very good thinking," said Faria with a smile. "When you told me everything about yourself, I too suspected Danglars and Fernand, but I wanted you to puzzle it out." Edmund went on. "There is one part of the puzzle I have not figured out. Why did Monsieur Villefort shut me up here forever when he appeared to believe my story and agreed I was innocent?" Faria nodded thoughtfully. "True, there is also something curious about his burning the letter from Elba. Why should the assistant prosecutor for the king destroy evidence as a favor to a sailor he had never met before?" "He must have feared me for some reason," answered Edmund. "But that is ridiculous. How could I harm such an important man?" Faria was silent for a moment. "You knew only one secret, the name of the traitor to whom the letter was addressed." "Yes, father, but the name was that of a stranger, Noirtier." At this, Father Faria groaned and lifted his arms to heaven. "There it is," he cried. "There is the reason. I know this traitor Noirtier. He is the father of Villefort, who is so ashamed of the old man that he uses his mother's family name." At this revelation of the reason for Villefort's betrayal of him, Edmund became very pale. He leaned toward Faria and said urgently, "I must have revenge. I must destroy these 3 men who have taken away my youth and given me 14 years of suffering in return. Let us double our working time on the tunnel." From then on, the work on the tunnel went rapidly. When they reached the last stone, which would give them access to the corridor, they scraped only a certain amount of plaster. They would remove the rest on the night of the escape. Until then, the stone had to remain fixed in its usual place. As they rejoiced at coming to the end of the tunneling, Faria staggered. Edmund dragged the half-fainting priest back to his cell and put him on his cot. Faria seemed not to be breathing. Hearing the jailer's approach, Edmund lowered himself back into the tunnel, and just before pulling the entrance stone into place, he called loudly, "Help! I am ill!" For the next few days, Edmund dared not use the tunnel. He was torn with anxiety about Father Faria. Was he alive or dead? Edmund kept his ear to the door of his dungeon as much as possible. Finally, he was rewarded by overhearing 2 jailers as they talked. "I like him, though he is mad," said one. "Yes, it is too bad to see him paralyzed like that," said the other. Edmund's heart sank when he heard this news, but then it lifted, because Faria was still alive. A month went by before Edmund heard the old scraping behind his wall. Quickly, he moved the entrance stone and admitted the priest into his dungeon. They wept and embraced each other. Then Edmund wept some more when he saw that Faria's right arm and leg were paralyzed. But Faria calmed him. The old man had dragged himself with the greatest of difficulty to Edmund for one reason: to urge Edmund to escape alone that very night. Edmund drew himself up, his eyes flashing. My only friend, I swear never to leave you. While I waited for this reunion, I made a plan. We will fashion some kind of raft from our blankets and fish bones. We will escape as planned, and I will tow you through the water on the raft. Fariah's eyes filled with tears again. You are my true son, but I will be too great a burden. Go now, alone. Edmund was firm in his refusal. He helped Fariah back to his cell and promised to come later that night to begin the raft. When Edmund appeared, Fariah was studying a drawing on a piece of cloth. The priest beckoned to Edmund and put his hand on the young man's head, as if in a blessing. Very solemnly he announced, Edmund Dantes, sailor of Marseille and my adopted son, I declare you my heir. At my death, all the riches that I inherited from Cardinal Spada will belong to you. I do this in gratitude for your love and loyalty. He then explained the drawing, which was a treasure map. It showed one cave among many, and in that cave one stone among many. When pushed aside, the stone would reveal a corridor. 4 feet farther on, a concealed spring would open an entranceway into the room where the Spada treasure lay. When the priest was sure that Edmund had memorized the map, he burned it to ashes. Edmund had listened obediently, but with fear in his heart. Surely this was the talk of a madman. When Fariah told him the amount of money that the jewels, gold bars, and silver household objects would bring, Edmund was certain the jailers had been right. 70 million francs, he repeated. It cannot be. Father, you must rest. Fariah knew what Edmund was thinking, and waved his hand impatiently. My son, I am not mad. I know I will never leave the Chateau d'If alive, so let me finish the information. The cave is located on the island of Monte Cristo. Do you know it? Yes, said Edmund. The Pharaon passed it often. It is small and uninhabited. Fariah nodded and asked Edmund to help him to his cot. As he lay down, his pale face twisted with pain. With his last breath, he gasped, Farewell, my son. Do not forget Monte Cristo. Edmund stood frozen at his friend's bedside until dawn, when the sounds of stirring by the jailers sent him flying back into the passageway. There, he heard the jailer order Fariah's body to be sewn inside a shroud and buried that very evening. Once back in his own cell, Edmund gave way to his grief. Alone. He was alone once more. So for the second time in his life, Edmond Dantes resolved to die rather than continue to live in misery. Having been forced to leave Fariah's cell so rapidly, Edmund had not had time to say a proper farewell to his dear friend. The soldiers had left, and he determined to see the beloved face once more by chancing one more trip through the passageway. It did not matter if he were caught. His life was over too, so Edmund returned to Fariah's cell. If only I could die too, he cried upon seeing the priest completely encased in a thick woolen shroud. Then I would leave this dungeon just as you are about to do, my dear friend. As he uttered these words, Edmund was struck by a sudden and terrifying idea. My God, he murmured, I must not die now. I must punish my executioners first. Since it is only the dead who go free from here, I must take the place. Chapter 9. The Cemetery of the Chateau d'If. Edmund carefully undid the stitches that enclosed the shroud and kissed Fariah's forehead. Then he ripped open the shroud down its entire length. Gently lifting the corpse, he half pulled, half carried it through the tunnel into his dungeon. He arranged the corpse on his cot and covered it with his blanket so Fariah's gray hair did not show. He often lay thus, not turning when his jailer brought dinner in. The man had always ignored him, satisfied to see that his prisoner was still there. Panting from tension and from his exertion, Edmund rushed back to Fariah's cell. The dinner hour was nearing, and the jailers would soon come by. He grabbed Fariah's knife, needle, and thread from their hiding place under a stone and jumped into the shroud. Pulling its sides together around him, he began stitching from his feet up. He worked feverishly because he could hear the jailers coming closer, delivering dinners. Edmund sewed faster and faster. He had put in the last stitch over his head and clapped his hands to his sides just as the jailers reached Fariah's cell. As they passed, they were silent out of respect for the dead. Edmund was sure they would hear his heart beating. But they passed on. Edmund's hand closed on the knife handle. He assumed that the men who would be burying him would not overwork themselves by digging very far down into the rocky soil. The soil they piled on him would be airy enough for him to breathe until they left. Then his knife would easily cut him free from the grave. If, however, on the way to the cemetery the carriers became aware they held a live body, he was determined to rip open the sack and attack them with his knife. Dinner time passed, and Edmund's heart slowed a bit. No alarm had been sounded, so when the jailer had brought dinner to number 34, he must have believed the body on the cot to be a sleeping Edmund. Somewhere near midnight, Edmund heard the door open. Men with lanterns entered Fariah's cell. Edmund held his breath. He felt someone grab him under the shoulders and another take his feet. They swung him onto a stretcher placed on the floor. One of the men gave a grunt. "He's heavy for an old man. It's good we don't have far to go." Edmund felt the stretcher being lifted. He was carried from the cell, down the corridor, around corners, and up some stairs. He heard two large doors open before him and bang shut after him. Cold air penetrated the woolen shroud, and he heard the waves breaking on rocks. After 14 years, he was out of the Chateau d'If. The stretcher swayed and dipped as the two carriers stumbled on the rocky ground. They stopped. One man held Edmund's feet in the air, while the other tied a rope around his ankles. A heavy weight of some kind was put in the stretcher next to his feet, and the rope was knotted to it. The men picked up the stretcher again, breathing more heavily because of the added weight and because they were walking up an incline. The sound of the waves became louder. "Let's do it from here," said one. "No," said the other. "Up a bit higher. They made such a fuss about that last one we let fall on the rocks, that we better get the mad priest far out to sea." At these words, Edmund's heart started pounding even faster. He was not to be buried in the earth, but in water. The sea was the cemetery of the Chateau d'If. They put down the stretcher. Edmund was gripped under the shoulders and by the feet. He was swung to and fro, to and fro. 1, 2, 3, and away, the men chanted together and let go of Edmund. He flew through the air, out, out, and then down. Edmund screamed in terror, a scream that was soon swallowed up in the roar of the waves. The iron weight tied to his ankles pulled him feet first into the ice-cold water. Edmund held his breath. Even before his whole body entered the water, Edmund had begun ripping open the shroud, but he could not free himself because of the weight tied to it. He was dragged deeper and deeper under the waves. With tremendous effort, Edmund bent and sliced the rope between his ankles. He was suffocating. In another second his mouth would open and the sea would pour into him. Suddenly the weight dropped off and his body shot to the surface. Edmund drank in great gulps of air, all the while moving his feet vigorously to keep himself afloat. He didn't dare stay above water for more than a few seconds at a time. He dove beneath the waves and swam harder and faster than ever before in his life. Forced to surface for air, he looked back at the cliff from which he had been thrown. He could barely make out two figures against lantern light. Edmund doubted that they could spot him in the dark, but he swam underwater again as a safety measure. The next time he surfaced, he was a good distance from the Chateau d'If. It had started to rain, and a rumble of thunder came from the left. Edmund remembered another rocky island outside the harbor, a twin of the prison island, but uninhabited, and he headed for it at a steady pace. He wanted shelter from the approaching storm, and he also feared a cramp from the cold water. The thought that he might drown, now that he was free, gave Edmund strength. The storm broke just as his feet touched the rocky bottom of the shallow water. Torrents of rain engulfed him as he staggered onto the beach and sank down. Though he was near exhaustion, he quickly crept toward a rock overhang, where he would be protected from the lightning that was flashing across the sky. He fell asleep instantly. In an hour, an especially loud clap of thunder woke Edmund. He shivered in his wet clothes, and he was hungry and thirsty. Lifting his face to the rain, he was able to take in some water. Then he slept again. When Edmund awoke the second time, the storm was over. His fears returned with a jolt because now it was daylight. His jailers would have discovered his untouched dinner and Fariah's corpse. A search must be underway at this moment. In the bright morning light, the Chateau d'If stood out black and forbidding. As Edmund stared at it, he imagined the activity within. The jailers would probably search the island he was on, first examining the smaller rocks that peppered the sea between it and the prison's island. Then they would go on to Marseille as the next logical place. Edmund began to despair. He had lost his knife, his clothes were in rags, and he felt weak from lack of food. Even if he could reach Marseille, did he dare show himself there? Edmund scrambled from rock to rock, trying to shield himself as much as possible, in case someone with a spyglass should happen to notice movement on an island known to be uninhabited. He found parts of a wrecked ship, a beam with the ship's name, a red woolen sailor's cap, and nothing else. Suddenly Edmund gasped. A small white cloud rose from the Chateau d'If. It was followed a few seconds later by the burst of a gun. It was the alarm for him. Just then, another movement caught his eye. A large, fast sailboat of the type used by smugglers was leaving the harbor of the island he was on. Edmund had to make an instant decision. The smugglers might turn him in for the reward, but at least it was a chance for escape. He jammed the red cap on his head and picked up the large wooden beam bearing the ship's name. Ignoring the cuts of sharp-edged rocks, he ran back into the sea. Holding the beam, he swam toward the boat. Chapter 10. On Monte Cristo at last. Edmund swam on a course that would intercept the boat. As he neared it, he flung himself half out of the water and yelled. His calls were heard, and the boat turned to steer in his direction. But in raising himself out of the water to hail the boat, Edmund had expended his last bit of strength. Just as a rowboat was being lowered for him, Edmund lost his grasp on the beam, which had helped him stay afloat, and he began to sink. "Help! Help!" he called, struggling to the surface. The rowers doubled their efforts. As Edmund was about to sink again, the rowboat reached him. One rower called to him in Italian, "Courage!" Edmund was too weak to lift a hand for the men to grab, so the Italian who had spoken to him seized his long hair and kept his face above water. In another moment, the others had hauled Edmund into the boat, where he immediately lost consciousness. Edmund did not waken until he was aboard the large sailboat. The Italian sailor, Jacopo, was pouring rum down his throat. Edmund sputtered and came to his senses. As he gasped his thanks to his rescuers, he saw that they were, as he had feared, smugglers. The captain was suspicious, and looked back and forth from Edmund to the puffs of smoke of the alarm gun at the Chateau d'If. Edmund had to come up with a story, quickly. "I am from Malta," he gasped, "and I was shipwrecked in the storm last night. My captain and shipmates were all drowned, but I was able to cling to a piece of wood from our ship. You can still see it floating out there." Jacopo interrupted. "I almost didn't grab you. With that long hair and beard, you looked frightening." Edmund silently blessed Father Faria for having sharpened his wits, because he could now come up with a logical answer at a moment's notice. He explained, "Once, in a moment of danger, I made a vow not to cut my hair or beard for 10 years if I was saved, and I was. That 10 years is up today, and thanks to you, I am rescued and can now cut both." The captain was still thoughtful. "What am I to do with you?" he said. "I am a sailor. Maybe you can use someone who has sailed these waters for years." The captain's eyes gleamed. "Can you set a course? And do you know the best harbors?" Edmund nodded. "Certainly. I will prove my worth to you right now. Why do you zigzag your ship so much? It wastes time." "If I didn't," answered the captain with a superior smile, "we would run straight into the island of Rion." Edmund stood up. "Let me take the wheel. I will steer a straight and fast course, and we will not hit Rion." The captain's attention had now shifted completely away from the alarm gun. "All right. Show me what kind of sailor you are." Edmund took the wheel and gave orders about the amount of sail. Gaining speed, he steered the ship past Rion, coming close, but not dangerously so. "Well done," said the captain, very impressed. Jacopo and some others gave a cheer, for they enjoyed good seamanship. After this proof of his abilities, Edmund was hired for the duration of the voyage to Leghorn, a city on the western coast of Italy. Jacopo gave him trousers and a shirt. The Italian sailor had adopted Edmund as a special friend, since it was he who had rescued him. By the time the ship reached Leghorn, Edmund was rejoicing again in the life of a free sailor. The captain entrusted the ship more and more to him, for everyone could see that Edmund's seamanship was superior. At Leghorn, the captain begged Edmund to stay with him, and he did so. They took on cotton and tobacco, on which no duty had been paid, and sailed with that cargo to the island of Corsica. There, they smuggled it to another ship, which planned to carry it to France. For this venture, all hands received 100 francs apiece, and were highly pleased. Edmund made several other voyages with illegal cargo, and they were just as successful. He regained his strength from the good food, clean sea air, and regular exercise. But imprisonment had caused an unusual change in his body. As a young man at sea, Edmund had the sunburned face of a bronze god, but now, in spite of the hot Mediterranean sun, a permanent pallor marked his face. Jacopo continued to be his friend, and Edmund taught him to handle the ship. The Italian was overjoyed by this, for such knowledge would enable him to rise above being just a deckhand. Jacopo often asked Edmund if he were not someone other than a mere sailor, because he spoke and carried himself like a person of refinement. Edmund would only smile and not answer. One night, when they were on shore in Leghorn, the captain took Edmund to a tavern for a meeting with other smugglers. There, they were asked to take on a shipment of Turkish carpets, avoid paying duty, and transfer it to a ship bound for France. Some deserted island would be selected where the cargo could be transferred in privacy. The captain of the other boat leaned over the table and whispered, "Why don't we meet at the island of Monte Cristo? It will be halfway for each of us." Monte Cristo. Edmund's mouth went dry. The captains toasted their agreement for meeting on Monte Cristo with a glass of rum for all the smugglers. They did not notice that Edmund drank his with a shaking hand. Edmund's boat arrived at Monte Cristo ahead of schedule, but his shipmates had no interest in going ashore. The island was uninhabited, rocky, and full of caves. Edmund announced that he would go ashore to try to shoot a wild goat for their dinner. Jacopo offered to go hunting with him, but Edmund put him in charge of building a fire on the beach to roast the meat. Edmund walked quickly into the interior of the island and toward the caves. He never hesitated in his direction, for in his mind he saw Father Faria's map and heard the priest's instructions. When he reached the mouth of the correct cave, he sat down and did nothing for a half-hour. He wanted to be sure he had not been followed for some innocent reason. When he was sure he was alone, he walked into the cave, his heart beating wildly. He concentrated. The back of the cave, the right stone moved, the corridor, the hidden spring. A door rolled back. Edmund stepped into the dark room beyond. After 14 years in his unlighted dungeon, Edmund had no trouble seeing in the dark. In a second, he would know if the jailers had been right about Faria being a mad priest. He looked around and gave a great sigh. Father Faria had not been mad. Cardinal Spada's treasures lay before him. There were diamonds as large as eggs, rubies carved into roses, silver platters engraved with historical scenes, and piles of gold bars. 4 chests opened on emeralds, and pearls fashioned into collars, necklaces of matching yellow diamonds, and other marvelously worked pieces resting on layers of loose jewels that reached the halfway mark in each chest. Edmund dared not stay long. He dipped his hand into one chest and poured a stream of flashing jewels into his handkerchief. He thrust the bundle inside his shirt and left. Outside, he smothered his elation, saying very quietly, "Thank you, my dear friend and second father." Then he hurried off to shoot a goat for the crew. Tomorrow would see the end of Edmond Dante's smuggler. Tomorrow would see the beginning of Edmond Dante's Avenger. Chapter 11. Caderousse Tells All. The smugglers welcomed the other boat to Monte Cristo, transferred their cargo of Turkish carpets, and received their usual pay, 100 francs for each man. Edmund took his pay like the rest, but he smiled, for the smallest jewel in his handkerchief was worth 10 times the entire payment to the crew. When they anchored back in Leghorn, Edmund told the captain he would not ship out again. The captain offered to double his wages, but Edmund still refused, thanking him courteously. Seeing Jacopo's unhappy face, Edmund took him aside. "My rescuer," he said, "I make you an offer. I need such a man as you, a man who is loyal and can hold his tongue. Will you come to work for me?" Jacopo brightened instantly. "I would like nothing better. It is true, then, as I suspected, that you are not a sailor?" "I sailed on this smuggling ship for amusement. But yes, I am a sailor, among many other things. Now get your belongings and wait for me in the town square." Edmund went down a back street to the house of a dealer in precious stones and offered 4 small diamonds for sale. Though the dealer was accustomed to keeping an expressionless face, his eyes sparkled at the fine quality of the stones. He asked no questions as to how a poor sailor happened to own them. He gave Edmund 40,000 francs, and urged him to return any time he had more jewels to sell. Edmund joined Jacopo in the town square. From that moment on, Jacopo's amazement grew. First, Edmund ordered him to give all his belongings to the first beggar they met. Then he led Jacopo into the finest tailoring establishment in Leghorn. Here, Edmund ordered the doors to be shut to others, and all the workers to concentrate on himself and Jacopo. At first, the owner was indignant, but his eyes opened wide as Edmund tossed 1,000 francs on a cutting table. He immediately ordered the doors closed. Within an hour, Edmund and Jacopo had been measured for a variety of outfits in the latest fashion and of the finest materials suitable for a gentleman and his personal servant. Edmund ordered them delivered to the Royal Hotel, the largest and fanciest hotel in Leghorn, the following morning. The owner's protests that this was an impossible demand were cut short by a shower of more money. As a result, he assured Edmund that his tailors would work through the night without sleep. Checking into the Royal Hotel proved no more trouble than ordering their clothes. Edmund's money got instant obedience to his wishes from everyone. He was moved into a set of rooms usually reserved for visiting royalty. Jacopo hardly dared walk on the rugs because they were so soft and beautiful. Remembering all that Faria had taught him about life among aristocrats, Edmund ordered special dishes prepared and sent to his rooms, along with the finest wines, fruits, and cheeses. When their clothes began to arrive the next morning, Edmund gave his first important order to Jacopo. He was to go to Marseille, and, as inconspicuously as possible, he was to gather information on 3 people: old Monsieur Dantes, Mercedes, and Caderousse, their drunken neighbor. Jacopo left that afternoon with a purse full of money. Edmund himself went to Genoa, where the shipbuilders excelled in trim, fast vessels. As his carriage drove past the bay, Edmund noticed a small yacht being tested. His keen eye appreciated how well the yacht handled, so he stopped and sought out the owner. The owner, who was watching the tests sadly, was an Englishman. Many months ago, he had ordered the yacht built to exacting specifications. Since then, he had lost money in speculations and could not afford to pay the balance due on the ship. Without hesitation, Edmund offered him the full price of the yacht, plus 20,000 francs beyond. The Englishman was delighted. He signed the yacht over to Edmund immediately. Edmund found the yacht handled so well that with his experience, he was able to sail her alone. He made one change. He had a closet installed in his bedroom aboard. It ran the length of one wall, and from the outside, it appeared to be the wall itself. After several trial runs, Edmund set course for Monte Cristo, but anchored first at a nearby island. He waited there a day to be sure he wasn't followed or seen by a passing ship. Then he moved the yacht to Monte Cristo and dropped anchor in a hidden cove. It took him 2 days to carry the Spada treasure from the cave and store it in his newly made closet. He finished just in time to return to Leghorn to meet Jacopo. Jacopo's news was bad. Edmund's father had died many years ago. Edmund had expected this, but still his heart turned over to hear it as a certainty. Mercedes had disappeared from Marseille, and nothing was known about her. But Caderousse still lived there, and owned a small roadside inn. Jacopo thought the inn must be a failure, because the main road had shifted to another area, and no travelers went by. He gave Edmund the address, and Edmund set out for Marseille immediately. Jacopo had been right about the lack of travelers past Caderousse's inn, so it was a wonderful surprise to its owner and his wife to see a priest on a fine Hungarian horse coming down the road a few days later. Long before the priest could hear him, Caderousse was calling, "Welcome, sir, 1,000 welcomes!" The priest stopped. The black of his clerical robe contrasted sharply with the pallor of his handsome face. When he asked for Caderousse by name, it was in a thick Italian accent. "I am Gaspard Caderousse, monsieur," replied the innkeeper, "and my inn is at your service." The priest ordered a bottle of Caderousse's best wine, then announced that he had come on a mission. "I attended the deathbed of a prisoner named Edmond Dantes. He gave me a ring and asked me to sell it. He wanted the money divided among the 5 people closest to him in his youth, for he had come to think of them as his best friends. He named his father and you. He also named 3 men who I have not located yet: Danglars, Villefort, and a soldier named Fernand. Caderousse's joy and wonder increased when the priest produced the ring, a huge ruby set in gold. "But his father is dead," said Caderousse. "He died of starvation." Monsieur Morel, who had been Edmond's friend and employer, found this out too late to save the old man, who was too proud to beg. But Morel paid for his funeral, and it was a fine one. Edmond felt such pain at the news of his father's death by starvation that he had to remain quiet for a few moments. During the silence, a sly look came into Caderousse's eyes. He poured more wine for them both, and then said in a decisive manner, "It is wrong that those other 3 men share in the inheritance. Monsieur Villefort was the assistant prosecutor for the king at that time, and it was he who imprisoned Dantes. Monsieur Morel, the shipowner, and Mercedes, who was to be Dantes' wife, went often to Villefort to find what they could do to gain Dantes' release. He always refused to see them. Is that the action of a close friend? I say it is not." The priest nodded in agreement. "And the other 2 men?" he asked quietly. "What about them?" Caderousse looked uncomfortable and took more wine to strengthen his resolve. Then he poured out the story of the letter, which Danglars had written with his left hand and which Fernand had mailed. The priest looked at Caderousse severely. "This is a terrible story, if true. How can you know such a tale?" Caderousse flushed. "I was there." "What? You were there and permitted it to happen?" said the priest, shocked. "Please, believe me. I hardly knew what was going on. I was drunk. I had no real part in it," babbled Caderousse. The priest seemed to think it over. "I believe you, Caderousse. And since it is in my power to do as I believe Edmond Dantes would wish, I settle the entire inheritance on you alone." He gave Caderousse the ruby ring. Caderousse almost fainted with joy. "Oh, what have I done to deserve this good fortune? Maybe it is to make up for all the bad luck I've had in the past. Bless you, Edmond Dantes, wherever you are." Chapter 12. The Count of Monte Cristo. Shortly after Edmond's visit to Caderousse, upper-class society in Paris was delighted to hear that an enormously rich and charming nobleman had settled in their city for a time. Since many titles were bought and not inherited, no one cared that this nobleman's family had never been heard of before. The Count of Monte Cristo had money and good manners, and Edmond knew these were enough. After hearing Caderousse's confession, Edmond had decided to call himself the Count of Monte Cristo. He moved to Paris, sent Jacopo on many errands to gather information, and began his war of revenge. Edmond's first targets were Danglars and Villefort, co-owners of the largest bank in Paris. Danglars, always shrewd, had made a wartime fortune as a supervisor of supplies for the army. Though it was illegal for him to do so, he had purchased food and ammunition as a private merchant. Then, as head of supplies for the army, he had bought his own goods for the government at an enormous price. He was now among the wealthiest men in Paris, but his passion was still to have more money. Since titles could be bought, he became known as Baron Danglars. Villefort had become his associate, for he too always needed money. His connections with the government brought in international business and secret information. Though rich, Villefort had had some misfortunes personally. His first wife had died. His second wife was highly nervous and terrified of poverty. They had been childless for many years, but now had a son, Edward, for whom both parents would gladly have died. Villefort had come to the bank especially early one morning because Danglars wanted him to be present when he received the fabulously wealthy Count of Monte Cristo, about whom all Paris was buzzing. Exactly on time, the Count was announced and shown into Danglars' elaborate, antique-filled office. Danglars was disturbed by his first sight of the tall, slender man with a pale, calm face. The Count's clothes were so fine, yet not showy, that Danglars felt shabby in his own rich garments. He did not like feeling inferior, so he waved the Count in with a casual nod. "Please come in, sir." "No, it's Count, isn't it?" "This is my associate, Monsieur Villefort. Sit down here. This chair once belonged to the Emperor of China. Now it belongs only to a baron." Danglars laughed nervously as he spoke. Edmund nodded pleasantly to both men and handed Danglars a letter from the most famous bank in Rome, Thomson and French. Edmund had recently bought it, but had ordered the purchase to remain a secret. Danglars read the letter with amazement. "But it says here I am to give you unlimited credit while you are in Paris." "Yes," said Edmund. "That is the way I usually like things arranged." "But unlimited?" "No. We must settle on a sum beyond which you cannot draw," decided Danglars. "That is only good business." Edmund stood up. "Forgive me. I have been misinformed. I had been told yours was the largest bank in Paris, but I see you cannot meet my requirements." Danglars and Villefort exchanged a look of surprise. Danglars said, "Now wait, Count. Of course we can come to some agreement. Why don't we set the amount you can draw on at, say, 1,000,000 francs? I'm sure you've never had such good treatment any place else." Edmund was laughing. "Excuse my mirth, my dear Baron, but 1,000,000 is ridiculous. I carry that amount with me all the time, just in case I see some trinket I want to carry home with me." Edmund opened his money case and displayed more than the amount of money he had just claimed. Danglars stared at it open-mouthed. Villefort left his chair so he too could see. The partners exchanged another quick look, and Danglars said, "You shall have any amount you desire, Count. Any amount." "Thank you, Baron Danglars. Also, I may ask you to handle some investments for me from time to time. Perhaps I will buy some cargoes, cashmere or indigo from the East, you know. I will inform you what to buy, and most important, when to sell for me." "Our bank is at your service," said Danglars and Villefort almost together. The idea had come to them both at the same time that they could use the Count's instructions to invest on their own behalf. From then on, there was constant communication between Danglars and Villefort's bank and the Count of Monte Cristo. Funds poured out of the bank for Edmund's new house, his carriage and matched gray horses, his large staff of servants, his entertainments, and his antiques and paintings. Along with this activity, Edmund sent a stream of orders to invest in numerous cargoes from all over the world. Danglars did as ordered, and each time he and Villefort invested some of their own money in the cargoes too. The first 4 investments returned such handsome profits that they were angry with themselves for not having risked more money. Soon both men had invested all their available money and were using the bank's assets for themselves. They had no fears of a loss. When Edmund judged that Danglars and Villefort had overextended themselves financially, he came himself to the bank to order yet another investment, this time in a diamond mine. Edmund ordered 3 times his usual number of shares. Danglars was amazed. "Dear Count," he said respectfully, "this must be a very important investment, since you have come in person to order it." Edmund nodded solemnly. "It will make all my other investments seem unimportant. I expect to make huge sums." As soon as Edmund left, Danglars signed notes for credit on all his belongings, including his 4 houses, his wife's inheritance, his daughter's dowry, and all their jewelry. Villefort, aware of his wife's intense desire to have great wealth, hesitated. Then he reasoned that the success of this investment would make her 10 times as secure as she was now. So he followed Danglars' example. The 2 men spent the next few weeks envisioning themselves the richest men in Paris, except for Monte Cristo. During the next 2 months, reports of cargo shipments began to come in. Storms had wrecked ships, cargoes had been captured by smugglers, and men who had once been trusted with transporting cash had vanished with it. Though somewhat disturbed by these reports, Danglars and Villefort remained happy and confident of their great wealth to come from the diamond mine. Then the news came. The diamond mine was a fraud. Danglars, pale and trembling, rushed to Monte Cristo's house. The Count was having a late breakfast, and ordered coffee and fruit to be brought for Danglars. Danglars gasped, "Count, how can you sit there so calmly and eat? We are ruined. The diamond mine was a fraud." Edmund smiled. "I heard a rumor some time ago that it might be. Through Thomson and French in Rome, I sold my shares. I have lost nothing. This fruit is really excellent. Please try some." Danglars sank down in a chair. "Why didn't you tell me? I am ruined! Ruined!" Edmund pretended surprise. "Oh, I didn't know you were investing in my choices. You have my sympathy. Jacopo, I will have more coffee." Danglars rushed home. Without speaking to his family, he packed a suitcase with his clothes and his wife's jewelry. He raced to the bank and ordered all available cash brought to him. Neither the jewels nor money belonged to him, since he had already used both to gain credit to invest in the mine. With this fortune, Danglars fled from Paris. When Villefort arrived at the bank, he found the employees in a turmoil. No one had given them instructions, but with no money available, they had been forced to shut the doors of the bank. In Danglars' office, Villefort found the report on the diamond mine. At this crushing blow, Villefort felt his mind waver. He fell into a chair and stared unseeing at the wall. For 5 hours, no one could rouse Villefort, until the butler from his house suddenly appeared and spoke to him. Villefort's wife had heard that something was wrong at the bank. Since her husband had not come home to tell her what the matter was, she had sent their butler for news. Remembering his wife and his beloved son Edward, Villefort pulled himself together. He reminded himself that he still had his position with the government. Also, he determined to ask for his old position as assistant prosecutor again. Between the two, he could continue to support his family, though of course not in their present high style. In time, he might be able to amass another fortune. Leaning on the butler's shoulder, Villefort made his way home. Villefort went directly to his wife's room. She was in bed, recovering from a nervous spell, but sat up trembling when her husband staggered in. Gently, he told her what had happened, and that they must move and make a new life. He promised her and their delicate Edward every care. He would work night and day to regain their lost position in life. His wife seemed to take the news well. Villefort was still so shocked himself, he did not notice the terrible fear that suddenly flamed in her eyes. But she spoke calmly and asked that Edward be sent to her so she might have the pleasure of watching him at his lessons. Villefort left his wife and son together and went to lie down. A half-hour later, he was awakened by the butler, who was weeping and holding out a note to Villefort. In a trance, Villefort read the note, in which his wife bade him goodbye and asked forgiveness. "I must take Edward where he will be safe forever. I know that security for him and me no longer lies in your house, she wrote. Running to his wife's room, Villefort saw her slumped in death, cradling Edward, also dead, in her arms. She had poisoned herself and the boy. At this sight, Villefort's mind snapped. He began screaming and running about the room. He was so maddened that he did not notice the Count of Monte Cristo enter the room until he was standing beside him. "You have ruined me," he shouted at Edmund. "You are the instrument of the devil." "No," replied Edmund solemnly. "I am the instrument of your own past evil. Look at me carefully, Villefort, and see if you can see a young, innocent sailor whom you betrayed with a smile and kind words." Villefort started back, putting out his hand to ward Edmund off. "It cannot be. No, you cannot be." He could not go on. "Yes, I am Edmond Dantes," thundered Edmund, "and you deserve your fate." Villefort started to groan and weep. "I admit it. I deserved it. But they did not." He sank to his knees beside the bodies of his wife and son. Now it was Edmund's turn to gasp. He bowed his head for a moment and murmured, "You are right. I had no hatred of them, only of you, Villefort." Villefort looked up with a mad gleam in his eyes. "Not Villefort. Noirtier! 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 Noirtier!" He chirped his father's name like a bird, over and over. A doctor had now arrived, and he shook his head sadly at Villefort, who was dancing and capering about the room. "He is quite mad," said the doctor. "He must be bound, or else he will hurt himself." Edmund drove off with Villefort's screams and chirps trailing after his carriage. When he arrived home, he was greeted by Jacopo, with the news that Danglars had been located. "And as you ordered, sir, I had some of my old smuggling friends prepare a reception for him." And they had. The smugglers had stopped Danglars' carriage along the road and dragged him from it, along with his precious suitcase. He was tossed into a bedroom in a farmhouse, but not harmed. At first Danglars was terrified, but he soon regained his confidence and demanded food and drink. "Food has to be paid for here," said his guard. "Likewise drink. Can you pay?" "Of course I can pay," answered Danglars with scorn. "Bring me meat and wine." The man counted on his fingers. "That will cost 10,000 francs. For a moment Danglars was speechless. Then he cursed the man and announced he would rather starve than pay such a sum. He held out for 2 days and 2 nights until he got weak and thirsty. Then Danglars paid the 10,000 francs and was given a fine meal. This pattern went on for a month. Soon Danglars was down to his last 1,000 francs. After a lifetime of greed, he could not bear the thought of being penniless. He held out for a week. Feeling close to death, Danglars realized his foolishness. Creeping to the door with his money in hand, he called weakly to the guard to bring water and food. But it wasn't his guard who entered the room. It was a stranger, whose face was hidden by his cloak. "Do you suffer?" asked the stranger. "Yes, I am starving," said Danglars. "I know an old man who starved through your doing," said the man. "Do you repent?" "I don't know who you mean, but yes, I repent. I repent," said Danglars weakly. Edmond Dantes decided to show mercy because he was sorry for what had happened to Villefort's wife and son. He dropped his cloak. "I forgive you." "The Count of Monte Cristo!" cried Danglars. "No, monsieur. I am Edmond Dantes." Danglars gave a terrible gasp and fell backward. He trembled all over and wept. Edmund looked at him with contempt and turned to the guard. "Feed him and let him go with his 1,000 francs. I want him out of my life forever." Paris never heard of Baron Danglars again. Chapter 13. The Final Revenge. The young men of upper class in Paris spent several mornings each week taking fencing lessons. It was their ambition to hear a "well done" from the fencing master, who was their hero. Thus, young Albert Morcerf was amazed one day to see his fencing master hit 3 times in a row by his opponent's sword. When the match ended, Albert rushed over impulsively and congratulated the winner. The winner was amused at Albert's enthusiasm and introduced himself as the Count of Monte Cristo. The 2 men formed a friendship, though they were so much apart in age. At home, Albert talked constantly of his new hero. His father, General Fernand Morcerf, was annoyed that his son should admire another man more than himself. But his mother, Mercedes, was delighted that such an elegant and educated man should befriend her son. Albert invited the Count to tea to meet his parents. Even the general had to admit later that the Count was as witty and charming as all Paris had been claiming. But Mercedes, upon being introduced to the tall, handsome man, had grown faint and retired from the room. As part of Edmund's plan for revenge, he had sent Jacopo to Constantinople, Turkey, to gather information about General Fernand Morcerf, who had served in the army there and who had returned to France with a fortune. Jacopo had also brought with him a young woman named Haydée, the daughter of the dethroned ruler, Ali Pasha. Haydée told the Count how she had been sold as a slave after her father had been betrayed and killed. She accused General Morcerf, who had once been her father's friend, of the murder. Edmund saw to it that these accusations appeared in the newspapers, and that a committee of inquiry was formed. General Morcerf was forced to appear and hear the testimony of the daughter of Ali Pasha. Albert, horrified at the scandal, learned through friends one night that the man responsible for bringing this information to the courts was the Count of Monte Cristo. Half-crazed, Albert rushed through Paris looking for him. Then he discovered that Edmund was at the opera that night. Albert burst into the theater and noisily entered Edmund's box. Before the whole audience, he challenged the Count of Monte Cristo to a duel. Edmund nodded coldly. "It will be my pleasure, Monsieur Morcerf. Now, please withdraw, for my favorite aria is about to be sung." When Edmund returned from the opera, Jacopo said, "Sir, a lady has insisted on waiting for you. She would not leave." Edmund entered his parlor and found Madame Mercedes Morcerf, Albert's mother, waiting, her lovely face stained with tears. Edmund bowed politely, but she threw herself at his feet and pleaded, "Edmund, do not kill my son." Edmund's head jerked up. "What name do you call me by, Madame Morcerf?" Mercedes came closer. "Do you think I could mistake you, Edmund? When you walked into my house that first time with Albert, I knew at once you were Edmond Dantes. In my heart, I knew you." Edmund laughed harshly. "Yes, that heart, Mercedes. A heart that was first mine, then given to Fernand." "But I was desperate and lonely after you disappeared, Edmund," she cried. "I waited for years. I worked with Monsieur Morel for your release. Fernand was the only friend I had left after your father died." "And do you know why I disappeared?" Edmund asked scornfully. "Why, you were arrested and imprisoned." "Yes," replied Edmund, and then he began the tale of his 14 years in the Chateau d'If. As he talked, the pain on Mercedes' face increased. When he finished, she sat with bowed head, as if struck by a club. With an effort she finally spoke. You have suffered terribly. But was it necessary to expose Fernand's betrayal of Ali Pasha just because he married me?" Edmund's eyes were fierce. "No, Mercedes. I have exposed him because he betrayed me. He was the cause of my imprisonment." Mercedes' horror increased as she heard the story of the accusing letter sent by her husband. "I understand your need for vengeance, Edmund. But you are planning to duel my son. Why must this vengeance fall on the son as well as the father?" "I never intended to involve Albert," he replied sadly. "The young man's hot blood did that. But I will do as you ask. I will spare your son's life, but in doing so, I must die." "Die? What are you saying?" Edmund sighed. "I will go to the duel and fire my pistol into the air. Your son, whose skill at guns I myself have been improving with lessons, will fire at my heart. I have no doubt his bullet will find its home." "Ah, Mercedes, my life is about to end for the second time. The first time was when your husband put me in prison. This time, it will be because of your son's bullet." Mercedes could only murmur through her tears, "Bless you, Edmund. I was sure that the heart of the young Edmund I once knew could not have changed so much that it would willingly sacrifice an innocent boy. Thank you, my dear, and farewell." After Mercedes left, Edmund sat for a long while thinking about the past and his plans for revenge, plans he must now give up because he had not counted on one factor, his love for Mercedes. And he thought about the future, a future that would no longer exist for him after this day. When Edmund appeared at the secluded space in the forest chosen for the duel, Albert's seconds, or witnesses, were filled with anxiety. Albert had not been at home when they called, and they feared he had gone to the court to hear the verdict in his father's case. All knew there could be only one verdict after the testimony of Ali Pasha's daughter. In actually hearing his father condemned for treason, Albert might be too upset to aim his pistol carefully. Their relief was great when a carriage clattered up and Albert rushed from it. Calling to his friends, "I must speak to the Count of Monte Cristo, and I want you all to hear what I have to say." Edmund stood waiting calmly as Albert and his amazed friends approached. Albert bowed formally and said, "Sir, my quarrel with you did not concern itself with the guilt or innocence of my father in his actions toward Ali Pasha. My anger was in your bringing the matter to the attention of the courts. As you will soon hear, my father has been found guilty of felony, treason, and dishonor." Albert's voice did not falter as he said these terrible words. He continued, "However, sir, I have now heard of an even more wicked action by this same general. I no longer wish to call him father. It is a betrayal of an innocent young sailor, whose subsequent suffering cannot be spoken of without tears. The reason for this duel is now meaningless when compared to this betrayal. Oh, how I wish I could repay you for your years of suffering. As it is, all I can do is humbly beg your pardon, Count." Albert extended his hand, and Edmund took it with his head bowed. He realized that after he had offered Mercedes his life, this courageous woman had saved it by confessing a terrible family secret to her son, even though she risked losing his love by doing so. Albert then took Edmund's arm, and they moved away from the others. "My mother also told me that you and she were once pledged to one another," said Albert. "I can only wish that your lives had not been separated. Then I might have had a father I could be proud of." There were tears in Edmund's eyes as he drove home. Jacopo, looking nervous and worried, met him on the entrance steps. "General Morcerf is here, sir. The news about the duel has already reached him. In fact, half of Paris knows of the apology by now." Edmund did not hurry or slow his step, though his final revenge was at hand. He greeted Fernand coolly and offered him refreshment. But Fernand was in a rage. With blood throbbing visibly at his temples, he whirled to face Edmund. "What have I done to you that you have ruined my life? Is this some favorite sport of yours, to search out a man's past mistakes and punish him for them? And then, to add to my humiliation, my son turns against me and apologizes to my enemy. What is this power you have, and why me?" Edmund sat down and said calmly, "Oh, you are not the only one, Fernand. The other two I have ruined were Danglars and Villefort. They are your associates, I believe." Suddenly Fernand recognized the voice and made the connection between himself and the men mentioned. He shrank back and uttered a piercing cry. "No, it cannot be. No, Edmond Dantes is dead." Then he collapsed. As Edmund turned to leave the room, he looked back at the motionless figure on the floor and cried, "Not dead, but here before you. The Count of Monte Cristo has cut off your life, as you cut off Edmond Dantes' life." When Fernand came to, he was alone. He staggered to his carriage and made his way home. He was about to pull up at his door when he saw Mercedes and Albert hurrying down the steps, carrying 2 small suitcases. A public carriage drew up, and Albert helped his mother into it. "Do not look back, mother," he said. "This is no longer our home. Soon you will be back in Marseille, in the house where you were happy as a girl, and I shall be off to sea to seek my fortune." As the carriage rounded the corner, a shot rang out in the garden of the Morcerf house. General Fernand Morcerf had killed himself. The Count of Monte Cristo had taken revenge on the enemies of Edmond Dantes. Sometime that same night, the Count of Monte Cristo boarded his yacht to embark on a voyage alone. Jacopo shook his hand and tearfully asked, "Will we ever meet again?" "My friend," said Edmund, "only God knows what the future will bring, and until he decides to reveal that future to man, man must simply wait and hope, as I did for so many years. Wait and hope."